So, welcome back. Quick refreshment break. Grab a cool drink. Getting something ready. And I think Devan, to me, this is now critical. Everyone has said the one word.
We've got
policy.
the guy. Yeah.
Policy. And Clair alluded to Gaylor from TIPS, which is the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. And I'm hoping that Gaylor is going to really shed some light on this policy thing, because I think everyone's talking about policy. What does this mean, and how do we get the right policy so that we can unlock the full value chain in development in South Africa? And I think Gaylor is going to talk us through it and hopefully answer some of those questions, because everyone's saying the same thing.
Absolutely. And when, if he has an idea.
100%.
Because we know it's highly political, but ultimately that time point is when the light switch comes on for EV.
100%.
Looking forward to this conversation.
So, Gaylor, are you with us, sir?
I am, indeed.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think let's not waste any time, because I'm sure you've got a lot to speak about, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions for you. So, Gaylor, we're going to hand over to you and let you talk about exploring policy options to support the EV value chain development within South Africa. So, enough from myself and Devan here in studio, and over to you, sir.
Great stuff, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and share some thoughts on what it is indeed a very topical subject. You've said it, it's policy. And on the onset, let me raise that this is work we did in collaboration jointly with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC, and NAMSA, the automotive manufacturers. And for us, it's really critical because we're bringing both government and business together in order to do independent and evidence-based research. So trying to really bring everyone together. As a way of introduction, some quick fact, the obvious why we're here today. The EV revolution is underway. The sales of EVs are growing fast and faster than forecast in most countries, but in South Africa we are behind. But we are behind like most of the world, effectively. What's important though is that both government and industry have made it publicly clear that this is an area for growth in South Africa. This is the future of the automotive industry, and we want to go big when it comes to electric vehicles on the market, as well as on the industrial side of things. So I want to share some quick thoughts on the policy options to support both market developments and industrial development when it comes to EVs in South Africa. Let's first look at the market development, and we'll split this between passenger cars and public transport. Two quite different markets. If we think about passenger cars, that is our stock of electric vehicles in the country. It's about 6,000 vehicles, relatively small, of course, primarily some hybrid vehicles, but also some plug-in and some full battery vehicles. We don't really have fuel cell electric vehicles for now in the market. But if you look at this stock against the actual annual sales, well, if I didn't put the numbers below the graph, you wouldn't see EVs, all right? The two bars here are diesel and petrol cars. The EVs, you can't see them. The numbers are so insignificant. They're so insignificant because at this point in time, there's no incentive for customers. There's a lack of awareness. There's also not many models available. And there's still quite a sizable capital cost premium. EVs are much cheaper to run, but they're still more expensive to purchase in the country. So, what can be done about it? Often there is the issue of infrastructure and charging. I think it was mentioned that actually charging infrastructure in the country as we stand, given the number of electric vehicles that we have, is not seen as a major hindering factor. There is a lack of awareness and a lack of visibility for those charging stations, but that all goes away the moment you drive an EV. There's some teething problem around standardization, which are being addressed, but overall, as you can see on this map, quite a lot of charging stations already installed in the country, and certainly more than enough if we consider the limited number of EVs that we have. So what can be done? Well, there's a number of primary interventions that we can think about if we want to develop the market. The first one is to play with the VAT or the ad valorem excise duty, which is a duty that's on every good that is being sold in the country, and the higher the price of the good, the higher the duty. And that's all to try and reduce the upfront cost. You can reduce the VAT or reduce the duty. That would have a meaningful impact. It's possible to do it. The question, of course, is how do you justify it sociopolitically? You will end up reducing VAT or ad valorem duties on luxury vehicles that are mostly targeted for middle to high income households. So that's obviously sociopolitically difficult to justify. The second avenue, which the private sector always brings, is custom duties, the tariff. We need a level playing field, but we must remember that that only applies to battery electric vehicles, to BEVs, coming from Europe, which do fetch a slightly higher tariff, 25%, with regard to 18% for all other vehicles. So we would need to make sure that there is a level playing field. The question is, will this be passed through to customers? There's no guarantee by reducing the tariff that there will be. So we need a quid pro quo from the private sector that they will indeed pass that to the customers. The third avenue is looking at preferential finance. It would require a partnership with the financial institutions, but it would have a meaningful impact because interest rates are quite high in South Africa. And again, that would play on the capital cost. But we need to make sure, again, that it's not regressive, that we don't end up providing cheaper credit to high-income households that we would provide to the rest of the country. And the last key measure is really looking at flat level targets, saying, well, can we get a sales target? Maybe. That would really send the right signal that would push the market. But of course, we need to put the right targets. Too low and they become inefficient, and too high and we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So our primary options, they really aim to reduce the upfront cost of the vehicles. And that's through the VAT or ad valorem, the duties on the tariff duties and finance. And then you have that quid pro quo. If from one end we give, what does business bring in? We would need reduced prices. We need some sort of target. They could be aspirational, but some sort of target. And we would need to see some sort of trickle down with the manufacturing. We need to make sure that whatever support we implement is short-term and conditional. That's to make sure that it's socially acceptable and that we have that policy certainty in the long term. And we think that in the short term, we should be technology agnostic, so not differentiate between BEVs, plug-in hybrids, or even fuel cell vehicles. In addition to those four key primary interventions, there's a wide array of secondary interventions that could be implemented, which I've listed on the slide. I'm obviously not going to go through them, but that could support as well potential interventions. They're not enough to necessarily tip the balance, but they could be beneficial. Things like a reduced tax on fringe benefit for EVs, for example. Things like playing with the charging or the fuel cost, the licensing cost, the parkings, the tolls. You could have preferential advantages for EVs, but they're not enough to just tip the market. And then a lot of things could be done around non-financial incentives, as well as customer awareness. Again, as a complement to our four main interventions that I've spoken about. If we turn our attention to public transport, then we need to remind ourselves that the main mode of transport in South Africa is public transport. And that's why it's really important that we look at it, because car ownership is still highly segregated. And if we want to just transition to e-mobility, then we need to bring e-mobility to public transport as well, so that the technology is available to all. If we look at the primary interventions, we have some overlap. First one is, again, this VAT and ad valorem story. But here it's a lot easier to justify, because now you're targeting low-income households. So it's a question of opportunity cost. If I put my money as government into this, I can't put it somewhere else, of course. It could be done through the taxi recapitalization program, which is a program for the minibus taxi industry to introduce new vehicles, scrap the old ones, introduce new ones. It's trusted mechanism. Again, very easy to justify, but some cost implications. We could do it through preferential finance, very similar mechanism, but again, much easier to justify. And we could do that through public procurement, particularly for buses. Yes, it's really interesting because we can link that very clearly to local manufacturing. But we need resourceful and resourced municipalities to do that effectively. So if we look at public transport, we see that it's very progressive in terms of interventions. And again, we're trying to here reduce the upfront cost. It's the story around the VAT, the taxi recapitalization program, and preferential finance. What's interesting with public transport is that there's a very strong alignment potentially with supply chain and manufacturing. And that can be implemented through public procurement as well as the taxi recapitalization program. And I'll get back to that just in a minute. Like for passenger cars, there's again a wide area of interventions that can be complementary, kind of secondary interventions. And that can be around testing incentive. For example, here the tariff doesn't really apply because there's no issues with regard to the tariff for buses and minibuses. And in any case, there's a very symbiotic relationship between supply and demand on the local market, with quite a strong overlap in that respect. Again, fuel cost, administrative cost, and associated costs could play a role as a complementary measure. And then some other interventions around maybe vehicle right sizing and some non-financial incentives. So again, very important to understand the ambit that we can use to support public transport. But now let's turn our attention to industrial development. Here we'll look on the one hand on vehicle manufacturing and on the other hand at the supply chain. So if you think about vehicle manufacturing, it's important to remember that first we are, as South Africa, part of a global market. On the left-hand side, you've got the vehicles that are produced and exported, and on the right-hand side, the vehicles that are sold and imported. Roughly, without getting into details, you'll see that roughly half of the vehicles produced in South Africa are exported, and roughly half of the vehicles that are sold in South Africa are imported. So we're very part of global dynamics. But we do have quite a strong vehicle manufacturing base. It's a key industry in South Africa, often heralded as the one success of South Africa's industrial policy. But we are only 22nd in the world when it comes to vehicle production. So again, we are dependent on global dynamics. We're not number one. When it comes to our automotive products, they go primarily to the EU as well as to the US. And that's critical because these are two markets that are quite rapidly and quite aggressively moving towards e-mobility. So our export market is at threat if we don't change our production. Today, there's only one hybrid passenger car produced in South Africa by Mercedes-Benz. And there is some production of niche vehicles. We have a fully electric refrigeration truck, for example, being produced in South Africa. We've got three-wheeler utility vehicles, but no mass production. So what can be done? We need to look at this from a vehicle perspective. We also need to look at it from the buses and the minibuses. On the bus side, we've got strong local body manufacturers, but very weak local content. So there's a lot of imported part and then being assembled here. But we have some interesting developments when it comes to EVs, both for battery and fuel cell vehicles. On the minibus side, we've got two strong producers, primarily Toyota, but also BAW, that are producing minibuses for the local market. And again, some interesting EV developments in the country, but primarily around conversions to date. So if we look at the primary interventions to support vehicle manufacturing, the first and most straightforward avenue is to use the APDP. The APDP is the Automotive Production Development Program. That's the policy support package negotiated between government and industry to support the development of the automotive industry. The question, of course, that if we think about adding additional support for EV production, it might be hard to justify because the automotive industry is already one, if not the most supported sector of our economy already. We can think about pulling manufacturing through local demand. In the short term, this is only truly relevant for buses and minibuses. As is mentioned, there's quite a symbiotic relationship on the local market between supply and demand of buses and minibuses. It's all being assembled and in some cases produced here. Import and export dynamics are very small. It's not really relevant for vehicles though, because we need to reach quite a high volume before we can pull manufacturing. And as we all know, volumes are very small at this point. So until we get quite high volumes of consumption of sales, basically of electric vehicles domestically, it's going to be hard to justify production here. Last but not least, fleet level targets can again be used, although these are sales targets. It would be hard for us to put manufacturing targets. We're only 22nd in the world. If we put manufacturing targets, most likely shoot ourselves in the feet. So how that can trickle down to manufacturing remains a question. In terms of policy implications, it's clear that the manufacturing of e-buses and e-minibuses is closer than the manufacturing of electric passenger cars in the country. We need to be aware of this misalignment between market development and industrial development. We may have to do the market development first and then have industrial development come on the back of export market until it can be supported domestically. If we're serious though about stimulating manufacturing, this has to go through the APDP. There's a number of mechanisms to do that, but they will have to be temporary and phased out over time, probably where we see increased support for EV production and decreased support for ICE production. Of course, the quid pro quo, investment and supply chain development by industry. Once more, there's a wide array of other additional measures that could be implemented as support, primarily to support smaller business ventures, small and medium-sized enterprises that are entering that space, most likely in niche markets, as we have actually in the country in quite a few. That could also be done through special economic zones, as we have already done, and increased testing and certification capabilities in the country, which is sorely lacking in some respects. If we turn our attention to our last area, the supply chain, the first thing to remember is that there is some overlap, obviously, between the EV and the ICE supply chain, but there are, of course, some completely new areas around the battery value chain or the fuel cell value chain. If we look at South Africa, the first port of call is, of course, the minerals. We have a wide array of minerals relevant for the production of EVs. And that's very clear just looking at some of the key minerals in South Africa for batteries, for example, manganese, titanium, nickel, iron ore, phosphate, cobalt, and copper. And of course, when we're talking about fuel cells, we have platinum, and we are the world leader when it comes to platinum. If we look at it from the regional perspective, we have every single mineral, including lithium in Zimbabwe. But we want to go beyond just mining, of course. So what about mineral beneficiation? Well, in South Africa, we've got a long-standing experience, but actually there's very little domestic refining of minerals for battery production in the country. Only manganese and aluminium are refined to battery grade at the moment, and we have potentially nickel and lithium in the pipeline. If we look at our export of components and parts, we are a strong player, but again, mostly going to Europe, with the exception of engines that are mostly going to India. So this is at risk going forward because catalytic converters don't feature as strongly in the mobility of the future, and that's true as well of engine parts. But we have some vibrant EV-related manufacturing industry. That's the case in R&D. That's the case in the lithium-ion battery value chain, with some really good players around the battery manufacturing. Not necessarily cell manufacturing, but battery manufacturing indeed. We've got some players in vanadium-based batteries, in fuel cells, as well as in charging infrastructure. Some a really vibrant EV-related manufacturing industry and we're actually about to release a completely new report on the lithium-ion battery value chain, which will detail all of that in very great detail later this week, actually. So what about the interventions? Well, the APDP here is, again, quite an important avenue. Even though it hasn't delivered much on supply chain development, there are recent changes to the program that should improve that by improving the emphasis on local content. But if we're really serious about supply chain, the second area is looking at mineral beneficiation. And we need a policy for that. That can be through development pricing, so pricing the minerals domestically cheaper for local companies, or have an export tax. Importantly, we also need value chain development. That's to support all our small and medium-sized businesses that are operating in the space, for example, in battery manufacturing. So in terms of policy implications, it's pretty clear that we have the minerals, but we want to move beyond this. Having the minerals is not a competitive advantage. It's a comparative advantage that warrants that we look at it. We have key strengths in battery manufacturing and in mineral beneficiation that we should harness going forward through both top-down and bottom-up strategies, as well as ecosystem support. You've got it by now. There's always a number of secondary interventions that can be implemented to support that ecosystem, but we focused on the primary interventions. So if we conclude, we see that the development of e-mobility is really multifaceted, and we've only looked at 4 components of the market. We didn't even look at commercial vehicles, three-wheelers, two-wheelers. Just by looking at 4 components, it's already complicated. That's why we think trial and error is the way to go. We shouldn't discriminate between technologies. All technologies have a role to play, and we should focus on our strengths. EVs represent the only platform going forward to have a modern, sustainable transport system, especially if we couple that with our developments around renewable energy. And importantly, we think that the time to act is now. Yes, we have unknowns. Yes, there are many other areas to explore. Yes, we do not know everything. But the time to act is now if we want to seize the opportunities and be a strong player in that field going forward. You can access the full report here on the TIPS website. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So, Gaylor, I think it's really interesting. I mean, you've shared a lot of insightful stats, some data, and I think maybe what we want to try and do now is break it down to some basic understanding, so that the man on the street can understand what does this all mean. And I think the most important question is, to me, and we've just come from talking to an OEM, is that how crucial is it that South Africa's automotive industry undertakes this transition to EVs? Some people say, well, can't we just keep producing internal combustion engines? It seems like a pretty obvious question, but based on what we've talked. But I'd like to your insights in terms of why can't we just keep producing ICE engines?
Sure. And it's a very important question. Look, for the short term, we could very well keep producing ICE, and we will. The question is, over the medium to long term, it's evidently clear that our export markets, EU, US, are shifting to EVs. So that market is gone. Going forward, that's going to be gone. Then you've got 2 options. You got one option and say, what, I'm going to keep with ICE, that's what I know how to do, and I'll find new markets. I think this is a flawed argument, because new markets are going to be restrained. There's going to be less and less new markets. And the few markets that are still going to be available, there's going to be really a lot of competition. And eventually, we'll be forced to move to EV production. But we'll be on the back foot. Yeah. So the option is actually to be a lot more proactive and say, let's do it while we're still producing ICE. Let's bring in the EV on top of it. and position ourselves for the economy of the future. That's what being proactive is about.
100%, and I think you've touched on something really important there is that we've got to be proactive. There's a couple of questions. I'm going to paraphrase 3 comments that I can see in front of me, where what you're basically saying is we need to be forward thinking. We need to start upskilling our resources now. We can't say in 5 years' time when we want to do it, because then it's too late. Yeah. Because if we do it in 5 years' time, and I think this is a comment that I love, is that we're going to be left behind, and the only thing we can produce is ice, because OEMs and big manufacturers would have already chosen their production facilities elsewhere, which is something that we cannot afford in South Africa's economy. In our job environment, we just cannot afford for these OEMs to start choosing alternative markets because we're so far behind. So I suppose the question, and I'm going to paraphrase, is Gaylor, from your perspective, what do we need to do now, and when I say now, in the short term, in the next 12 months, what do we need to do to make sure that we can start changing policy and start making sure that South Africa is positioned as a manufacturing destination for the OEMs?
Indeed, and I think it was mentioned, I think in the previous presentation, is that we do not control the OEMs.
Yes.
Right. It's not, government doesn't decide, oh, you coming here and you producing that vehicle. This is part of global strategies for OEMs, and we have no control whatsoever over that. What's important to do is to send the right signal, because you have OEMs which now go to their headquarters and say, I want to bring vehicles to Africa. And then the first question that's being asked to them is, okay, what kind of policy environment do you operate in? And here we have little to say. There's just nothing at this point for electric vehicles. So we need to send the right signal. What has happened on the back of the research that I shared is that the automotive industry, EMCSA, put together a position paper as industry, highlighting what their position is, what they think is required. At the same time, government, led by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, has been doing the same thing. Trying to say, okay, what can we put together to support industry? This is moving very rapidly at this point, and negotiations are imminent, really, between industry and government on that front to put together the package of interventions. Of course, what's going to come out of that, we don't know yet.
Sure.
But we need this to come as soon as possible to say we are supportive of that transition. It's not just talk. It's been in the media. The minister has made it very clear publicly. Champions of industry have made it very clear publicly. What we need now is action, is the measures on the ground. We need to tweak maybe our interventions around the PDP and so forth to say we are serious about it. And that's really coming in the weeks and months to come, actually.
Okay. Fantastic. So,
and in your opinion, if we hit that green light now, and if we get that approval now, how soon before that gets, say, real legs on the ground? So if they say APDP changes, we can now build EV cars, there's the right incentives. In your opinion, from that decision to the time we can see a real increase in electric vehicles on the ground in South Africa, what's the timeline that we are looking at?
Well, I think when it comes to sales, this could be moving quite quickly. We could, if we get the right incentives, let's say this year, I think 3 to 5 years, you could have really significant share of electric vehicles in all their forms on the South African market. Sales is something that can move very quickly, providing that we make it attractive for consumers. That's all that matters. It has to be attractive.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think, so I've just seen a comment come through, which I actually love, and I think it puts you maybe a little bit on the spotlight here, Gaylor, so I hope you don't mind. It says, one of our attendees just said, if you, Gaylor, let's say you're now head of DTI, you're the decision maker, you're the man who can take the call. Okay, if you were given the responsibility to implement just one policy out of all the options, and you could do it as quick as you can, which one would it be?
The $1 million question.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, as I said, there's no real silver bullet, but look, the main hindering factor is the upfront cost for customers. Okay,
Sure.
it's the high capital cost. So that's where I'd go. And look, that can be done probably through maybe a reduction in the duties overall, either through the VAT, through the excise duty, and of course the leveling playing field on the tariff. If we do that, look, that will, and of course there's quid pro quo from industry that, this is passed through to customers, otherwise it's pointless. Then I think, you're making the vehicles cheaper. You don't need to make the business case on running the vehicles. That's there. We need to make it, okay, instead of paying much more, we can have that. And then if I have a choice as a second measure, then I go to the financial industry and saying, let's do something on the interest rates. Let's reduce the interest rates. Let's get some financial product so that it's more attractive for electric vehicle buyers to purchase a vehicle. That's what I would do when it comes to the passenger car market.
Fantastic. And I think that to me makes logical sense. I mean, I know you said there's no silver bullet, but that is one where we can have an immediate impact by doing that. That can be an immediate change. So that makes a huge amount of sense.
Yes.
Devon?
No, agree completely. And then, with the financial institutions, though, call it, what are the options? I mean, obviously, it still needs to make business sense to them. Yes, there's a value to be financed. In your opinion, Gaylor, do you even have an idea maybe in terms of a deal structure? Because it is going to cost somebody money. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the consumer is looking to say, what's my rents per month? And this car versus an ICE car. Now this is the reason why I choose an EV. Any ideas in your mind right now as to how they will go about to incentivize EVs?
Sure. Look, that can be done fairly easily. We've done that a lot in the renewable energy space, where you get development finance provided by maybe bilateral donors, European Development Bank of sort, or even our local development banks, the IDC, the DBSA, provide concessional finance, so cheap finance to our financial institutions. We can then offer lower interest rate on EVs. As I said, it's been done regularly when it comes to the rollout of renewable energy. It's also been done for energy efficiency interventions quite largely. We haven't seen that when it comes to EVs. There's also some interesting possibilities about packaging EVs with solar panels.
Yes.
And I know some manufacturers, so OEMs are looking at that. But we need to say, if you can offer a package to customers, you're buying a car, but you're buying a package. You're buying as well, solar panels. Then you can reduce again the cost of finance and the overall cost of your offering. So there are really a lot of options to do that. Then there's more sophisticated in terms of pay as you save, which you can do on leasing and that kind of thing. But for upfront ownership, it's definitely possible to do that.
So I suppose maybe for the more pessimistic of us, there's been a comment and it's come through a couple of times from a few different viewers, and there's, in summary, what they're saying is it in government's interest to actually do these policy changes, Gaylor? Because we know South African government earns quite a lot of money from the fuel levy. They earn quite a lot of money from carbon tax on motor vehicles. And I suppose the more pessimistic viewers out there are saying, but it's not in the government's interest. Because if they open this floodgate and they allow the electric vehicles in and they offer these incentives, and in South Africa we're going to charge from solar panels, government's standing to make a huge fiscal loss from this decision. What can you offer from inside and into that? I mean, because obviously that is a consideration for government. Fuel levy gets slashed, it's a massive income earner. What kind of insight can you offer to our viewers on that?
Sure, and thanks for that question. I've actually done some work on that previously, and I can also share some previous research on this. It's true that, of course, yes, there would be some revenue loss from one side. I mentioned the fuel levy. But it's important to take an holistic view about the costs and the benefits. We may lose on some aspect in some areas, but in others we will dramatically gain. We mustn't forget that the largest import in South Africa is petroleum, liquid fuels. All right, that comes at a huge cost to the country. The cost of air pollution, health impact, comes at a huge cost to the country, mostly to our hospitals and our health system. Of course, the cost of the climate change impact comes as well, again, dramatically to the country. And we must look at the integration of EVs into the electricity or the energy sector overall. You can then start seeing dramatic reduction in the cost of running your transport system, running your energy system. So cost saving for municipalities, cost saving for our utility. So yes, if you have a one-sided view, you say, oh, well, we're losing on one end. That's true. Yes, the fuel levy will reduce, but we're actually winning or earning or benefiting on so many other areas that if you look at it from a net perspective, it's hugely beneficial to go towards e-mobility. And we also must remember that before we feel any impact on the fuel levy, we need quite sizable volumes of EVs into the system.
Sure.
Yes.
So in the short term, even if we grow the sales of EVs quite rapidly, we're still going to see in absolute terms increased sales of ICE. Okay, so, and then you have obviously a fleet that's going to be there for 5, 10, 15 years. So before we see a decrease in the sale of fuel, we've got some time to come and some time to prepare.
And I think, Gaylor, that's a great answer, because I think that's where maybe a lot of us, laymen, people on the ground, normal, we say, oh, government doesn't want to allow the policy because they're going to lose money on the fuel levy. Yeah. And that's like, as you say, it's a single-sided perspective, where what you've just offered is actually a much wider perspective, where we say, you're going to lose on one side, but you're going to benefit of all these other cost savings on the other side, which is going to more than make up for what you've lost on this side. And I think that's a great perspective, Devon.
Great, yeah.
So
now we just needed to somehow get to the right ears, and those right ears need to sign the right paperwork, so we can.
So Gaylor, maybe touching on that subject, as yourself, as tips, can you offer any insight? Because I think there is a lot, and I'm going to give you the last 2-3 minutes of your session to give us this insight. I think there's a huge amount of degree of frustration, if I'm being honest, amongst people who are EV kind of fanatics or enthusiasts, and everyone can say this is the right thing to do, and we can provide sustainable energy, and we can have solar, and we can package cars, and all these wonderful things that we've heard up until this point, which actually tells me that South Africa is ready for EV adoption. Why do you think, or maybe let me answer this question, when do you think we're going to see government actually, you mentioned it's going to be imminent. Can you give us any kind of insight where we can say, all right, by the end of this year, we can expect to see something, or 6 months, and when can we expect to start seeing some wholesale changes to policy which really affects e-mobility in South Africa?
Sure, and look, you point to understandable frustration. We should have been moving faster. We could have been moving a lot faster. And let's remember that anything to do with the automotive industry tends to move fairly slowly in South Africa. It's one of the key successes of the country's industrial policy, and everything is well oiled and well negotiated between government, business, labor, and other social partners. So things do move slowly, and I think we need to acknowledge that. As I mentioned, look, we're definitely going to see some changes this year. Actually, if it hadn't been for the COVID-19 crisis, changes would have come last year. But we had a bit of a setback, of course, with other priorities. But it's now firmly back on the agenda of government and of cabinet, and it's certainly firmly on the agenda of the automotive industry. So I expect some implementation in the coming months, definitely this year.
Fantastic, and
Wow.
I think that's something that we
Good
can maybe we can end your session on and say, hear it here first. Dare I say, is that within the next 12 months we can expect some big implementation, and hopefully when we come back in 12 months' time for EMCSA next year, we'll be talking about this policy implementation and all these things. So Gaylor, I think that's a great bombshell that you've dropped on us. And I think that's going to excite a lot of people to say, we're talking short term, we're talking 12 months. And it's on the agenda of government, it's at parliament level. This is something that is going to happen soon. And I think that's phenomenal. From my point of view, that makes me really excited. Devon, any final thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a big bombshell. Thank you, Gaylor, because I know how the OEMs think and how they plan their future models and, their future model introductions. And that kind of policy change will have an immediate impact in the numbers and the kinds of cars that they import. And up to now, they've not imported enough EVs because it just didn't make sense. There was not enough volume, there was not enough pull from the consumers. Now that policy change is exactly what they've been waiting for, so that'll incentivize them to get the cars in. And once the cars are in, it's their job to sell it. So they'll do their job, and we'll get the volumes.
Fantastic.
So thank you.
So Gaylor, for myself and Devon here at the EMCSA studio, thank you. That's a great bit of news that you left with us on this Tuesday afternoon, and thank you for taking some time out of your day. I know you're a very busy man, and sharing your insights with us. Hopefully we can have you back again in 12 months' time, and we can talk about how those policy implementations have fundamentally shifted the value chain, and we can start looking further down the line. So thank you so much for joining us, sir.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cool. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Great afternoon. See you soon.
So we're going to go to a very quick lunch break. I think on that bombshell.
That's another bombshell.
Implementation of policy changes within the next 12 months, actually within this calendar year, he said. Now, that's a guy who government, OEMs, everyone's listening to. So he's in the know. He knows what's happening.
Yeah.
That is a great one. That's a really big piece of news. So we're going to go for a quick lunch break. We're going to be back on the hour at 2 o'clock with Robert Kuchen. And he's going to be talking to us about the environmental impact of low and zero emission vehicles. Because as much as we know they are less environmentally impact than your internal combustion, they do still have an environmental impact, and we need to be aware of that. So a little bit of an interesting different side of the discussion that we're going to be talking about after lunch. We're going to break for lunch, and we'll see everyone back in half an hour at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone. And have a great lunch break.